The Office was... Nope. I will get to that one another time. There we go. The Office is an American sitcom that was originally broadcast on NBC from 2005 to 2013. The first season is a little rough, but The Office from seasons 2 through about season 5 is one of the best shows of its kind. Unfortunately, it goes on for another 4 seasons after that. So, what made The Office great while it was great, and what caused its creative decline in its final years? Well, many factors contributed to both of those things, factors which I might discuss in future videos, but for this video, I want to focus on just one of those contributing factors, and that is how The Office portrays, or fails to portray, the actions of its characters having lasting consequences. A key element of the premise of The Office is that Michael Scott, the manager of the titular workplace, who is played by the always outstanding Steve Carell, acts inappropriately on a regular basis. In reality, a man like Michael would have been fired a long time ago, so a certain degree of suspension of disbelief is required to enjoy the show. But with that allowance in place, in its strongest seasons, the show plays as relatively realistic most of the time. Yes, the antics of Michael and the ongoing, mostly one-sided prank war carried out by Jim against his fellow salesman and arch-nemesis Dwight are beyond what most real employees at an actual office should ever have to put up with. But within the heightened reality of the show, characters rarely do things that are so outrageous that they break our suspension of disbelief. And when someone does go too far, there's always something there to check them, and to remind us, the audience, that there are limits to what these characters can get away with. In Michael's case, this check usually comes in the person of Toby, the office's gentle, woebegone, irrationally despised human resources representative. When Michael locks most of the staff in the conference room after they indicate that they think working in their office is worse than being in prison, Toby calmly persuades Michael to let them out. When Michael passes out copies of the Kama Sutra in a misguided effort to educate his employees on Indian culture, Toby steps in and collects them over Michael's objections. Likewise, Jim's tormenting of Dwight is aggravating and sometimes even a bit cruel, but it never rises to a level where Dwight is seriously physically threatened by whatever prank Jim pulls. There is quite a bit of petty theft, Jim putting Dwight's belongings in a vending machine, for example, or moving his desk into the men's room, and some mild assault, Jim slapping Dwight in the face when Dwight boasts about his ability to defend against attacks from the front, Jim slapping him again in another episode as the punchline to a joke, but little or nothing that violates the show's own established rules, at least not too egregiously. And Jim's pranking does lead to observable consequences. Almost never for Jim himself, which is another issue for another video, but for someone. For example, when Jim provokes Andy to angrily put his fist through a wall, Andy is forced to attend anger management classes and is absent from the show for 5 episodes. A norm is reiterated. Actions have consequences. You can't punch a hole through a wall at work and expect to escape accountability. But as the show moves from its middle years into its later years, that norm starts to erode. The antics of Michael and Jim and Dwight in particular, and the rest of the cast to a certain extent, grow more outrageous and cartoonish, while the consequences they face for those actions grow less and less meaningful. For example, in the season 5 episode Stress Relief, Dwight attempts to demonstrate the office's lack of emergency preparedness by blocking the exits and starting a fire. During the chaos that ensues, Stanley suffers a heart attack. Dwight's punishment for this is to be stripped of his position as office safety officer. Later in the same episode, Dwight hijacks a CPR class, destroying and bizarrely mutilating the expensive training dummy. His punishment for this, being forced to apologize to the office and obtain signatures from his coworkers indicating that they accept his apology. Even by the show's own relatively loose standards, deliberately setting a fire at your workplace is surely a fireable offense, no pun intended. In an earlier episode, Stanley, the character who suffers the heart attack as a result of Dwight's fire drill, is nearly let go for briefly losing his temper after being pestered by Michael. If yelling at your boss is considered grounds for possible termination, how can you possibly do what Dwight does during stress relief and still keep your job? The later into the show's run we go, the more the characters' actions don't seem to yield realistic consequences. In Season 7's Christmas episode, Jim throws a snowball in Dwight's face, in the office. Dwight retaliates by brutally assaulting Jim with snowballs on multiple occasions throughout the day. Jim deserves it because he's a dick, but it's still the sort of thing that could and probably should get somebody fired. Instead, nothing happens. Near the end of Season 7, after Michael has left the company, Dwight, temporarily in charge, accidentally discharges a gun in the office. He isn't fired. In fact, he's even allowed to interview for the job as permanent manager. In Season 9, Andy, having been promoted to manager at the start of Season 8, is absent from work for 3 months without telling the CEO of the company. When the CEO finds out, Andy gets away with a mild rebuke. Now, why is any of this important? The Office is a comedy, after all, as long as it's funny. Does it really matter if after a certain point its characters don't face serious consequences for their actions? Should we really hold a comedy to the same standard to which we would hold a drama as far as establishing and respecting consistent rules for the way its world works? In fairness to those who might react in that way to what I've been saying, my answer to that last question is not necessarily. There are times when a comedy can get away with stretching or even breaking its own rules when a drama might not. The website TV Tropes calls this the rule of funny. Characters can do things they ordinarily wouldn't be able to do or behave in ways that are contrary to their established personalities, and we in the audience will accept it as long as it gets a laugh. The Office takes advantage of the rule of funny throughout its 9-season run. Even in the later seasons, there are truly funny moments in almost every episode. Many of these moments involve characters acting out of character, incidents that stretch or flat out break the established reality of the show, but they still work, in the moment at least, because they make us laugh. The problem is that, while the laughs never quite stop, they do grow more and more infrequent as we get into the final few seasons. Like its British progenitor, the American version of The Office mixes comedy with moments of pathos from the very beginning. Yes, we're supposed to laugh at these characters, but we're also supposed to be emotionally invested in them. We're supposed to care whether or not Jim and Pam get together, or whether or not Michael and Holly get together, or whether or not Dwight and Angela get together. It leans quite heavily on will they or won't they romance plots for the dramatic bits in hindsight. As the laughs begin to dry up, the show depends more and more on its dramatic elements to hold our interest. There are episodes during the final season especially that seem less like a sitcom than a drama with a touch of absurdism. And that would be fine too, if it worked. Unfortunately, for me at least, it doesn't work most of the time. And one of the reasons it doesn't work is because by the time we get to those later seasons, we've already seen more than enough evidence to conclude that these characters live in a world where their actions don't have lasting consequences, and the choices they make don't really matter. For example, one of the most prominently featured plot lines in Season 9 involves Jim starting a business in Philadelphia and the strain this places on his and Pam's relationship. They're married with kids by this point. There are almost no laughs in this story. It's played straight all the way through. But the drama doesn't work because there's never any credible tension. Are we really supposed to believe that Jim and Pam are going to split up in the final season of the show? After everything they've been through, after every previous teased conflict between them has been resolved with a heavy dose of schmaltz, which is exactly how this conflict is ultimately resolved too, by the way. And after we've already seen time and time again in both funny and serious situations that no matter what these characters do, nothing all that bad ever happens to them, even when it probably should? The Office developed the habit of breaking its reality for the sake of laughs, and in doing so made it much more difficult to do effective drama, which it came to rely on pretty heavily. But the show also hurt its ability to pull off comedy. The thing is, comedy, especially when it's presented in a narrative form like a sitcom, requires many of the same conditions to be successful as drama. Anyone who's ever taken a creative writing class knows that a dramatic story needs tension and conflict to drive the plot forward and motivate the characters. And a comedy needs those things too. The funny things your characters say and do will make more sense and leave more of an impression if your characters are compelled to say and do those things by clear motivations that the audience can relate to. Let me turn from The Office for a moment and give you an example of this from another of my favorite sitcoms, Three's Company. If you've never seen the show, it's about a man sharing an apartment with two women. There are many wacky misunderstandings, lots of slightly naughty innuendo, with much of the action being driven by the lead trio's ongoing struggle to get the rent paid. I enjoy Three's Company from start to finish, but like most dedicated fans, most of my favorite episodes come from the show's second and third seasons. After season 3, the trio's landlords, the Ropers, leave to star in their own spin-off. The Ropers are replaced by a new landlord, Mr. Furley, and though Mr. Furley is played quite amusingly by the legendary Don Knotts, and though there are still more than a few classic episodes to come, I think when the Ropers depart, the show loses something important that it never quite gets back. That something is tension. Mr. Roper is shown to be not completely heartless, but his relationship to the protagonists is nearly always adversarial. He's the heavy. He's the villain. He wants something that our lead characters don't have, the rent. And if he doesn't get it, he has the power to impose consequences, to evict them, or, at the very least, as he threatens in one episode, to move them to a smaller, shittier apartment elsewhere in the building. After some initial bluster, Mr. Furley very quickly settles into being a friendly character. Yes, he's the landlord. He technically has the power to evict Jack, Janet, and Chrissy, and later Cindy, and still later Terry, from the apartment, but he rarely even threatens to do so after his first season on the show. Three's Company is a silly, light-hearted show. The world in which it takes place resembles our own even less than that of The Office. But even so, it benefits from the presence of a credible source of tension. After the Ropers leave, it goes from a show about three working-class young people driven to comically extreme lengths to keep a roof over their heads to a show about three increasingly successful young people who find themselves in wacky situations for, one reason or another. It depends, really. The same thing happens to The Office. Once we figure out that Michael is never going to be fired, no matter what he does, and that he's never going to fire anyone who works for him, no matter what they do, and that The Office is never going to go out of business, no matter how many times characters talk about working in a dying industry, and that once Jim and Pam get together, they're going to stay together no matter what pops up to threaten their happiness, that compelling, motivating feeling of tension is gone. In a sitcom, as in a dramatic series, there needs to be a source of conflict. There needs to be something for the characters to feel anxious about, or to push against, or, at the very least, there needs to be the believable possibility that bad things might sometimes happen. Choices have to matter. Actions must have meaningful consequences. Those conditions being in place don't guarantee a good show, but they sure don't hurt. And if they are established and exploited by clever and creative writers and directors and actors, you could wind up with a true classic on your hands, like The Office during its best years. In the absence of tension and conflict and consequences, well, I won't say it's impossible to pull off an effective sitcom, but it's pretty unlikely. It's far more likely that you'll end up with something like The Office during its final years. And there's not too much funny about that.